Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is a tough Friday morning. It's the Ides of March. I guess we were told to be aware of the Ides of March. Friday, March 15th, 2019. And, okay, once again, and I had to note it in the Morning Post, belatedly in the Morning Post, we once again enter the show under the cloud of a mass shooting. Yes, I mean we. By we, I mean humans here on Earth. The shooting, of course, happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, but felt around the world as these spectacular events often are, and this one, in all the worst ways, qualifies, and I guess just another of numerous examples of, well, look, we got to change the way we think about a lot of things. I've been watching the reporting and analysis of events there, laying it at the feet, laying it at the right feet, but perhaps we want to rethink some of the labeling that goes along with it. Maybe labeling isn't important, I don't know, but for lack of a better term, we've come to think of the ideology driving this sort of stuff as white nationalism, except that it appears to be transnational in nature. This, again, happened in New Zealand. But again, a guy who has left behind a manifesto, apparently, citing the inspiration of white people we call white nationalists all around the world. People from Donald Trump supporters and Donald Trump himself, for that matter, here in the United States, to Anders Breivik in Norway, and this is like the fourth or fifth person who's carried out one of these attacks who's brought up those same names, and the activity is obviously international in nature, and I feel like we're separating it from somehow quote-unquote real terrorism by coddling people, by calling them domestic terrorists or homegrown terrorists, which are a different strain, but I mean, and very often, it's separating itself. As a matter of fact, the homegrown thing, I was in response to my tweeting this morning about, it's not domestic terrorism, this sort of coddled, different type of terrorism. And like we're supposed to give you points for calling it terrorism or something, but then you slap the domestic label on it, which is, in the United States at the moment, appears to be designed to be understood to mean, oh, well, right-wing white guys who kill people of whatever persuasion here at home, well, those are domestic terrorists, as though it was different in kind. And, of course, dead people are dead people, and they don't care very much anymore about the niceties of what kind of terrorist killed them, making sure that the label is proper. But when the ideology is, one, transnational, and two, is spread around the world via the internet, and people can point with ease to inspiration being taken from actors in other countries, just so long as they're white and killing people who are perceived as the enemy of their whiteness, then it fits. And they're as much international terrorists, and these things are as much international terrorist networks as any of the ones that we have panicked and pointed to in the past, which has led in some ways very directly to this kind of response to Muslim communities and communities of color and Jewish communities around the world. So it's a tough day, to be sure. There are many things going on, and we'll probably shift our focus just because, well, one, there's not a great deal of news on this that we're ready to share, and two, we're never going to be the news source for the latest information on what's happening in a mass shootings aftermath in New Zealand. So we'll leave it to the professional journalists to ferret out what details there are that are fit to share, and to those on the ground in New Zealand to figure it out. But it affects all of us around the world. We can't leave it all to them. We all have to process this in one way or another and figure out what it is that we make of this thing and how to do it. And a lot of people pointing out quite correctly that a lot of the roots of it are manifest here in the United States. Angelo Carasone passing around, and I saw through Oliver Willis sharing a reminder that 4 years ago at the outset of the Trump campaign, very pivotal moment in which a questioner at a campaign rally he puts the question to Trump, when are we going to do something about all these Muslims? When are we going to throw all the Muslims out of the country? And our current president, which was, of course, at the time Barack Obama, our current president is one. He's not even American. And Trump very coyly, wryly smiles and laughs the whole thing off because, of course, he knows he drove a lot of that. And he knows, I'm running for president now, and there's cameras in here, and I'm going to get in trouble in some way if I don't disavow this. But all he's able to do to disavow it is that wry smile. Like, I'm not the one saying this, don't look at me. But it is a pivotal moment because, of course, we already have and had at the time the video of John McCain being confronted by someone at one of his events saying that Barack Obama is a Muslim, and he stops the proceedings and says, no, you're wrong. And it's something that Donald Trump was not only not willing to do, the most he was willing to do about it was smile and chuckle and laugh. And then when he opens his stupid mouth, all he has to say about it is, well, we're looking at that very strongly. We're going to be looking at a lot of options, including the one you just named, getting rid of all the Muslims in the United States. But I didn't say it. You said it. It's just a lot of options. So, I thought very rightly picked up on and pointed out. And I don't know. What else do you want to say about it? I mean, it's quite correct to point this thing out. Let me, I guess I'll mark that for later distribution and inclusion in the summary, which I will have to get to you later this afternoon. Let's see. There's a lot going on today, and I guess I'm just going to have to scroll through a little bit of it and see what we can make add into a show here today without getting too far off the mark. Let's see. I'll use this as a jumping off point to discussing something that happened yesterday that was referenced also in the Morning Post. And lots of reports on it, but why don't I go to a Daily Kos interpretation of it. Mark Sumner wrote it up for the front page there. You will have noticed, no doubt, yesterday how Donald Trump spent his day. Trump threatens to send police, military, and bikers to make things, quote, very bad for his opponents. So let's take a look at Mark's interpretation of this in an interview with Breitbart, which is, of course, the alt-right platform that sold itself as exactly that, which is, of course, exactly the ideology that resulted in and encouraged the murders taking place in Christchurch, New Zealand today. Or I guess it was today, yesterday, there when this, I'm not certain what time exactly it was, but you know how the timing thing and the international date line works. But in an interview with Breitbart, he's still doing them. Donald Trump had a not at all subtle message for his opponents. I have the support of the police, the support of the military. This is all doubtful, by the way, but the support of bikers for Trump. I guess you can be pretty sure about the support of bikers for Trump. I have the tough people, but they don't play it tough until they go to a certain point And then it would be very bad, very bad. I don't even know. I guess you're not meant to be able to nail down exactly what the hell he's talking about, but the hint is clear. Trump doesn't make it clear necessarily who they are or exactly what would have to happen before his collection of soldiers, officers, and bikers would be released to make things very bad. Not that the details are required. Trump is making it clear he thinks he has the muscle on his side to get his way by brute force. No democracy required. And remember, you should keep in mind in all of this, one, that, and as he does in the concluding paragraph, Mark notes in his testimony before Congress, Trump fixer Michael Cohen stated that he was concerned Trump wouldn't leave the political stage even if he lost an election. Trump is certainly making that concern very easy to believe. So lots of attention paid to this yesterday, as was right. But I wanted to note for you this morning that it is a curious combination that he has put together there. We know that the initial thinking there, the impression we're meant to take away, of course, is that there's both the officialdom of the state and the unofficial cadre of Trump supporters outside of the state who are scary, who can also be used as enforcers, who stand behind the idea that he's the legitimate ruler forever of the country, whatever. But I also thought it was curious. We're meant to take one message from it, but here's another that I find of interest. It's curious that same strange combination of the police, the military, and bikers all have come to believe, not all police and military, obviously, but the people he thinks he can call on for this sort of dictatorial coup are all curiously exposed to actual training in the case of the military and police, and just sort of thought pollution, I guess, in the case of the bikers, but also to some extent in their private lives, the police and military. But all are sort of being trained to believe, sometimes officially, that the victims of this latest round of attacks are actually the suspect perpetrators of international violence around the world. And I think it's extraordinarily important to remember that when we're talking about police and military in particular, there are, in fact, in this country still government-funded programs in which speakers and lecturers are brought in to sit down with them in, classroom time for police and military, training them to think of Muslims as terrorists and terrorism suspects, and that they're in the right and that they ought to be using their official powers to investigate, harass, arrest, and otherwise detain and dissuade and combat people based on suspicion that comes from nothing but their affiliation with their religion. And then in your time off, if you want to do some additional reading about it and theorizing about what might be necessary to defend our country / the white race, depending on how radicalized you are, well, you might come to certain conclusions. I can't really say exactly what you might start to think about. But Adam Serwer out today in discussion, follow-up discussion to his piece yesterday, which was too long for reading yesterday, but maybe today is the day we make room for it. But pointing out earlier with an excerpt from his piece saying, I wrote about the history of the, quote, white genocide conspiracy theory. By the way, a lot of people of color dying in this white genocide theory, as it turns out, which treats the presence and immigration of those deemed non-white as an existential threat. Everyone loves that phrase. That hatred appears to have been the motive for the terrorist attack on Muslims in New Zealand. And he has a critical excerpt from the article here. The concept of white genocide, extinction under an onslaught of genetically or culturally inferior non-white interlopers, may indeed seem like a fringe conspiracy theory with an alien lineage, the province of neo-Nazis and their fellow travelers. In popular memory, it's a vestige of a racist ideology that the greatest generation did its best to scour from the earth. History, though, tells a different story. King's recent question, posed in a New York Times interview, may be appalling. Quote, white nationalist, white supremacist, this is Steve King, a sitting congressman in the United States, of course. White nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization. How did that language become offensive? He asked, right? But it is apt. That language has an American past in need of excavation. Without such an effort, we may fail to appreciate the tenacity of the dogma it expresses and the difficulty of eradicating it. The president's rhetoric about, you remember, the S-hole countries and invasion by immigrants invites dismissal as crude talk. And here he highlights, but behind it lie ideas whose power should not be underestimated. Adam goes on to say here, though, that I thought the more relevant expression here, his follow-up, notably, if you argue that people are threatening you just by being present, it opens the door to extreme measures. Anyone, even people simply going to worship in Pittsburgh or in Christchurch, become hostiles who can be justifiably targeted in perverse self-defense. And it's an excellent point, and another I thought I would share with you today to try and make, I don't know if making sense of the situation is exactly where we could go with this. I don't know if that's what can be said about this thing, but I don't know. I thought it should be added to the mix, along with, I guess, in addition to my admonition and those of actual trained journalists who are also picking up on exactly the same thing about making sure that this is recognized as an international or pan-national movement. I don't know if you want to really even, I don't know if you would dignify it. You don't want to dignify it with the word movement, but the fact is that there are people around the world who believe this, and they're striking around the world. And here, Presidential Daily Bulletin, white nationalists determined to strike in U.S. So they already have, and they're determined to do so again. And if you think you're safe in quiet corners of the world like New Zealand, I guess you're not either. And I guess that you should have been on notice for that since Anders Breivik in Norway, who wasn't even targeting foreign people or people of color. He was targeting people who tolerate them. So, I mean, I guess you're all on notice. And I mean that on notice to stray a little bit from the theme, but to tie it all back in. I noticed also yesterday, and people very rightly pointing out to me that the story behind what I'm about to segue to is, in fact, mostly clickbait and garbage. But it's worth noting that the Hill felt, justified in running with the story of mostly collected from, I guess, rumors locally that there are Democrats organizing to seek a primary challenger to Ilhan Omar, as they say in their tweet, just 2 months into her first term, and with a picture noting, of course, that here she is in her headscarf. OMG. I'm assured, and I haven't read the article, and maybe I should, just to be sure what they're getting at, although I have to watch out for auto-playing video here. Loading ad, and I've pressed the pause, and it doesn't register when it's loading. I'm not listening to you. I'm loading an ad. All right. Anyway, some Minnesota Democrats, it says, aghast at controversial comments made by Ilhan Omar, far less controversial, I think, than the comments made in Christchurch yesterday, but okay, are taking initial steps to recruit a candidate to run against her in next year's primary election, seeking to buck history in one of the nation's most progressive legislative districts. Anyway, I guess I won't bother with the rest of the article in that I think people have correctly identified that we're talking about local Dems, and you don't dismiss them. It's not like the caucus in the House is meeting and saying we got to get rid of this woman, but there are people who are in the caucus in the House who think that. They're just not showing up in this article. They're smarter than to put themselves on record here. And who would be responsible for ousting her? It would be local Democrats. So you can't dismiss it out of hand. And so it seems unfair in a way to start off by saying, some Minnesota Democrats are aghast at her comments. And I say, well, it's not really as bad as what happened. And it's clearly not as bad as what happened in Christchurch. Oh, well, how could you make that comparison? I'll put it this way. And I retweeted the article again today saying, cool timing, guys. And I don't know who I'm mad at for this one. The Hill for deciding that it was worth covering, Democrats in Minnesota for wringing their hands over this, and making a story. You can wring your hands all you want. I can't stop that. People having apprehensions. It's a thing. I have apprehensions, not necessarily about this, but about other stuff about which it is dumb to have apprehensions. But that's life. Sometimes you talk about them, and sometimes you're admonished for talking about them properly. And other times you censor yourself, and no, that's not a violation of your First Amendment rights. But anyway, I just it seems like overstating the case or unfair to blame people or connect people with this sort of hand-wringing with the murders in Christchurch. And it is. The point I'm trying to make with this is, how could they possibly have known how bad their timing would be the next day? You can't anticipate things like this. Yes, you can. Every day you should be anticipating things like this. That's the point of pointing out what things like what people like Donald Trump and others are doing daily. They're setting the table for these sorts of things, and then they happen. And so, I didn't do it, or you can't blame me. There's no one to blame but the perpetrators. They have individual agency. Yeah, but I notice that goes out the window the minute you find out that the shooter might be Muslim, or the minute you find out that there's a shooting and you don't know who did it yet, and Trump tweets out, it's probably a Muslim. And sometimes yes, and sometimes no. All I'm saying here is the table is set every day for this sort of thing. And if you look at this in hindsight and you say, well, yeah, in hindsight, this is terrible timing. How could I have known? But if you spend a few minutes thinking about it, you probably, well, here's what you should come away with. Before you let that story go, or encourage somebody else to let that story go and go on record and be quoted, whatever, you think it's an innocent thing, think through what would happen if tomorrow there was a massive massacre of Muslims somewhere in the world, anywhere really, and the headlines are side by side or a day after the other. Yesterday I was criticizing her for her comments and we got to get rid of her, and even though I was not saying it was because she was Muslim, people are going to understand that that probably has something to do with it after all. And how would that look side by side, juxtaposed with the big headlines of a massive massacre of Muslims somewhere else, even around the world? Or, God forbid, right there in Minnesota. How would that look? Well, I can't be blamed for it. No, you can't be blamed for it. But what if thinking that through? Because, look, everybody knows that at any time, anything can happen. Anything. Literally anything. But some things are a little more likely than others. And someone going into a mosque somewhere, or at this point, a synagogue somewhere, and killing everybody in it, can happen. Now, of course, had it been a synagogue instead, interestingly, I wonder whether the Minnesota Democrats who went on record saying that they were going to try to do this, as serious or unserious as it may be, would feel vindicated. And they would say, see, it's speech like Ilhan Omar's that we must get rid of because look what happens. I mean, I don't doubt that there would be some people who would jump on that. But it's just as likely to go the other way. And if it makes you pause and say, as stupid as it would be to blame me for this or to connect me to this, as unfair as it would be, someone might do it. And believe me, I'm just the dummy that'll do it to you too, right? But someone might do it. So should I pause? Let me think this through. Is this connectable to something? Well, you may come to the conclusion that no, it's not possible at all because too stupid or too unfair, or I don't care if it's too unfair. But you might also say, well, even if it just gives you pause for a second, say, maybe I'll change the wording a little bit. Maybe I'll back off a little bit on this or that. Or maybe I'll add a caveat that says something. Well, if it moves you to consider this stuff and to temper your language a little bit, or to give some fuller context that could help us understand it as being different from knee-jerk reactionary BS, then maybe it's a good thing if we all slow down. Now, here I am doing it live on the radio where there's really no opportunity to slow down, but I don't know. All I can say is the world is complex, clearly, but I don't know. There's also a certain amount of difference between my musing about it here and my seeking out somebody else's platform and saying, you know what you got to print tomorrow is my story about XYZ. If it tamped down a little bit on that, maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Okay, we'll gather our wits for 2 minutes and see if we can't make a transition to other things, or at least other approaches that are equally important next. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Well, carrying on solo today. Not easy, but there are more points that need to be made, and so maybe it's easier to carry this on in one person's stream of consciousness than in those of multiple consciousnesses. Is that a word? Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, who knows? I think it's probably easier to talk actually, between people at this point. But continuing on, one other point I wanted to make, a slightly different angle on all of this, is I'm just watching on Twitter, because that's where I watch everything. Let's say gun enthusiasts here and around the world, but mostly here, because let's face it, this is where we live. People doing the familiar dance of avoiding blame in all of this, either for the guns or for people who are enthusiastic about collecting those weapons of war that make this sort of thing possible. Though, yes, you can do it with just about anything. I know, I understand, and yeah, there's arguments about how much damage you can do with or without certain models of these weapons of war. But as you know, we've been through it before. Any semi-automatic weapon can do this, and you don't need any accessories. But it's a lot easier and more accurate if you have the certain kind of semi-automatic weapon with certain accessories. And I understand from the initial reporting from some of the news outlets that actually, know how to cover such a thing, and have the resources to do it, that local eyewitnesses described the gunfire as being automatic fire, that it was too rapid. Somebody saying, and nobody can pull the trigger that fast. And of course, well, on the one hand, you'd be surprised how quickly people can pull the trigger. And on the other hand, now there's plenty of accessories out there that make it so that you only have to pull the trigger but once. And of course, as we've described on the show before, you don't even need those accessories. I'll just, one more time, all semi-automatic weapons can do this off the shelf. The basic semi-automatic Glock handgun can be bump fired and fired just like a machine gun with one trigger pull without any modification and without any equipment. You can do it with your bare hands. YouTube, which bears no responsibility for anything. And by the way, I guess at this point we should insert the fact that yes, the shooting was streamed live on Facebook and et cetera, et cetera. So once again, social media finds its way into the spotlight, and I don't know how that could ever be avoided at this point. But yeah, YouTube is full of instructional videos on how to do it. But in case you find that inconvenient or you want to be able to do it with a certain amount of accuracy and make it feel like Call of Duty while you do it, yes, there are some accessories that can make it very easy and can even help you aim while you do it. And we all know about those things. Anyway, lots of people out there, of course, today doing the familiar dance of, you can't blame the guns. The people who do it are the problem. Individual lunatics are to blame for all this. And as I tweeted earlier this morning, it's that time again. It's individual lunatics are ruining it for all the law-abiding citizens who just want the right to march around with the same weapons, saying they want to do the same thing o'clock again. That's what time it is. Here's the thing to take away. Again, oh my gosh, it's all these individual lunatics. Search around. You know the stories. Take a look at what goes on and what gets photographed at what gets billed as patriotic Americans protesting Sharia law in this country. Well, I'm anti-Sharia. It's creeping Sharia in this country. People who come out to protest even the plans to build a mosque somewhere. Or, who shows up and how are they accessorizing their protest when they show up and protest outside of a mosque in Tennessee, which is where this, I don't know, for some reason it famously happens all over Tennessee, but it happens everywhere. Who shows up at the anti-Sharia protests? And they show up, and what are they wearing? Strapped around their bodies, AR-15s, to which they say, I'm just standing up for the right to have it. And I'm also here to protest creeping Sharia. But think about that and all the people who have been photographed. Now, we've been trained, or I should say our police and military and bikers, as it turns out. And note about the bikers, just since I'm doing stream of consciousness here. Where else in the world are pro-regime bikers invoked as political muscle? Does anybody have any idea in what other country this happens? It may happen elsewhere with a lower profile and maybe has escaped me. It may be that Cambodian bikers are wildly in favor of the current regime. I do not know. But it just happens to have a weird mirror image in, I don't know. Would you believe me if I said Russia? Because of course you would, because you're already there, because you've been listening to the program and reading the articles that we read. So your mind is as poisoned as mine because of the internet bubble, I guess. But you also might be right. But yeah, of course, we've read a bit about, and remember what a weird setting it was that we read it in. It was about the Trump Towers in South Florida that are populated so heavily by Russians. And of course, if they were populated so heavily by Muslims, you would have people marching around outside of them with AR-15s on, to get back to that point. But we learned at that point that one of the buyers for the $1 million condos is the head of a Russian biker gang that apparently had some sort of quasi-official paramilitary role in the occupation of Ukraine and Crimea. What? It surprised me then, and it shocks me, I guess, now to be reminded of that. I don't know that there's another example of that around the world, but I must be ignoring some sort of biker faction somewhere. But if I am not, then that's curious that would become a tactic in both Russia and then, I don't know, the United States of America and nowhere else in the world. That would be odd. It would be as if the leadership of those countries were sharing blueprints for dictatorship, autocracy, or international terrorism. I'm not sure which is which. But those same biker types, about which, it depends how seriously you want to take their threat. I will be honest about this. Occasionally, I've seen some photos of the Bikers for Trump rallies too, and though they try mightily to look like tough guys, and I'm sure they are tough guys, tough guys at a certain point get less difficult to deal with when they're 70 plus. When you're talking about old school original bikers, they may be crazy and they may be rendered dangerous by the presence of weapons as well. But there's also an element of it that seems eminently mockable, though today might not be the day. Anyway, there's also a crossover, at least in how they cosplay, between the Bikers for Trump and the kind of people that show up at the anti-Sharia rallies. I'm just a patriot protesting or I'm just a person who loves being white. Even worse, it gets, day by day, this sort of thing gets normalized. People who show up outside of mosques in protest and they come carrying those weapons, like I say, they've been photographed over the years and it's been blown off. It's dismissed. I mean, we tut at it and say it's horrible. It's dismissive of a lot of people's serious work to say we tut about it. They've been honest about what kind of threat it is, but the rest of the country hasn't taken them seriously. And even those of us who take them seriously haven't really necessarily put it at the forefront every day the way they have. And you can't, because it would drive you crazy to put all the necessary things at the forefront. And then we would be distracted from saying things like we've spent the last couple months saying, oh my God, all this is terrible, but the planet's melting. There's also that. Tough show today. But the people photographed showing up at the supposedly patriotic anti-Sharia rallies, they make a point of being seen carrying the AR-15s, even though any gun could do all of that. And they dismiss all criticism of doing things that way, of making their protests suddenly be about brandishing weapons by saying, well, it's two different things. I'm here because I am worried about creeping Sharia / hate Muslims. And I also just happen to have the gun because Second Amendment, blah, blah, blah. I could bring it anywhere. That's what the law says. And they're unrelated. I'm not actually marching around outside of a mosque, threatening the people in there with exactly the same type of harm that we just saw carried out in Christchurch, New Zealand, because blank. Because I'm not that guy, is their excuse. It's an individual lunatic who didn't know, you're not a responsible gun owner, you see. He's so irresponsible. Plus, he's an Australian and he's in New Zealand. It's not me, is what I'm saying. They're often their excuse. And yet, if the same rally were held today outside of a mosque, and believe me, there are people calling for that to happen, they're just being dismissed even within their own community right now, not because that's crazy talk, but because I'll get in trouble. I will end up spending time in jail because right now, the situation is such that the other more normal mainstream elements of the police, military, etc., but not including bikers at this point. Although maybe there are some bikers of conscience who would say the same thing. They would say, yeah, the public pressure would right now be such that I would have to arrest you, brother. And that would look bad for all of us. But any other day, you'll find people marching around outside of mosques with AR-15s strapped on, claiming to the people on their way in or out of the mosque, and any journalists who will listen, and any cops who are forced to listen, because they're stationed at the event, that no, they're two separate things. I'm not threatening them. I'm just standing near a mosque with exactly the same weapon that the guy just videotaped himself killing everybody in the mosque in Christchurch with, because I happen to have the right to do that, and because I hate Sharia/Islam, and because I feel exactly the same way about the other guy, but I have more self-control. Until I don't. At which point you'll know, because there'll be lots of people dead. There's no opportunity to intervene to dissuade me from, now you're crossing the line. You're becoming much more like that person in Christchurch, and I just want to warn you off of that, because I wouldn't want to spoil the Second Amendment party for the rest of the responsible gun owners who just want to march around outside of mosques the day after a massacre in a mosque. Or 25 days after the massacre of many people in a mosque, or a year afterwards, or I want to do it by a synagogue, or I want to do it at a Sikh temple because I can't tell the difference, or because I don't care what the difference is and I see no difference. Whatever it is. Or I want to do it at a gay nightclub because, again, what's the difference? Do you see what I'm getting at here? Is that all of the photos once proudly displayed as patriotic Americans standing up for themselves here in America, or standing up for white culture if they're really bold enough to say so, are now suspect photos of people who should be watched as suspects in the next such massacre, except freedom and First Amendment and Second Amendment and spying in this country, and makes it all very difficult to figure out exactly where to draw the line in all of this. But layered over that is that the people whose job it is to decide where to draw the line are the same people that the President of the United States says will come out for him in a coup. So, it's worrisome. But have a nice weekend. I don't know what to tell you, guys. We have to come here and vent this stuff. And, I don't know. The threads are there. We might as well tug at them. And the job is done. I have done it and ruined your weekend. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Moving on, maybe, to some other, I don't know, version of the same thing, I guess. Let's see. Where can we move to? Is there a connected story, or are we done with that? I'm sure we'll turn around and come back to it. But all right, well, here's a possible segue, I guess, if we can get the hell out of this one. Families of Sandy Hook shooting victims can sue gunmaker Remington over 2012 attack, court says, which I guess also means that if the same gun was used, well, you can't tell for sure how judges in another venue are going to rule. But does that mean that families of shooting victims in Squirrel Hill can make the same claim? It might not have been a Remington manufactured weapon there. I don't know. Pennsylvania jurisdiction versus Connecticut. But this is interesting and worthy of note, as this is all report. The headline comes from the Washington Post. The report there written by Fred Barbash. Connecticut's Supreme Court, and so it won't necessarily hold sway in Pennsylvania or anyone else, ruled Thursday that the manufacturer of the Bushmaster AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle, and it's a very popular model of the AR-15, can be sued and potentially held liable in the 2012 mass murder. You know which one we're talking about, and let's not bring that part of it up. We'll focus on the ruling. The groundbreaking 4-3 decision overcame a federal law backed by the National Rifle Association, who is, of course, just standing up for law-abiding citizens' right to visually and impliedly threaten a massacre at a mosque because freedom. The law is also, of course, designed to immunize gun makers from liability for the crimes committed with their weapons. Remington makes the Bushmaster. There are, because we connect everything here, there are presidential primary campaign implications to it. You know what they are. Everyone knows what the sensitivities are. They're just there. I'll leave them there. The suit was brought by the estates of 9 victims of, you know who the shooter was in Sandy Hook, who was armed with the high-powered rifle during his assault that left 28 dead, including 20 young children. The court's decision was narrow, with the liability for gun makers based on how they advertise their weapons, rather than on the sale of them to third parties who then commit horrible crimes. In its ruling, the court said companies that market military-style guns to civilians as a way of killing enemies could be violating state fair trade laws. State fair trade laws. All right. We'll take it. That's a fair interpretation of what's on the books in Connecticut. Will it survive scrutiny on any higher levels? Don't know. The regulation of advertising that threatens the public's health, safety, and morals has long been considered a core exercise of the state's police powers, the court said, explaining why the federal law does not apply. And it will be very interesting to see whether states' rights, small government constitutional originalists at the U.S. Supreme Court have any interest in intervening in this. There is that opportunity. But, and don't, put it past them to set all of that aside to save the gun makers either. That's entirely possible. Neither Remington nor its lawyers in the case could be reached for comment Thursday. They were busy, I'm sure. A spokesman for the company told the Associated Press that we have no timeline for any comments to be made on the subject. The families alleged, for example, that the Bushmaster product catalog shows soldiers on patrol in jungles along with the phrase, "When you need to perform under pressure, Bushmaster delivers," and promotes the rifle to civilians as, quote, the ultimate combat weapons system. Still, the decision was a breakthrough for those impacted by the Sandy Hook shooting. That's all of us. And for gun control advocates across the country who have found little to no success in seeking ways to hold gun makers responsible for crimes committed with their products. This is a landmark and potentially historic ruling, said Adam Winkler, a UCLA School of Law expert in gun regulation. It opens up an avenue to hold gun makers responsible despite federal immunity. It will encourage a lot more litigation against them, as well as potentially permit discovery of internal corporate documents. And that's true. And even if the thing is ultimately overruled in the U.S. Supreme Court, it does open up an avenue and will encourage a lot more litigation and will cost gun makers a lot more money to defend, even if they ultimately win. At a news conference Thursday, families of those killed joined their lawyer, Josh Koskoff, in praising the ruling, saying they were determined to find out through the discovery process, again an important point, what factors went into Remington's marketing practices. This is nowhere we wanted to be, said Bill Sherlock, whose wife died in the shooting. That being said, I'll spend the rest of my life on this avenue seeking justice. Now we can peel back the layers of Remington's advertising strategies. And believe me, it's important as part of the entire, what would we even say? Infosphere, the atmosphere in which these things happen. It's as important what people find on Facebook or see advertised to them wherever you would see a Bushmaster ad, or have validated for them by the manifestos of kooks or the manifestos of kooks who happen to be United States presidents. The totality of the information atmosphere is worthy of discussion here. The firearms company had convinced a lower court that the federal law prevented the family's suit, but Connecticut's high court said that the law had exceptions and that one of them was meant for state consumer protection laws. The family's fight is not over, though. The case returns to a local court now in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which must determine from the evidence whether Remington is responsible. They haven't established that they are responsible. Connecticut's Supreme Court has only given a lower court to kick it back down to where the suit is brought and say, no, you can't dismiss the thing out of hand because of the federal law. You now have to hold your trial to see whether Remington really is responsible. It may be that given permission to ask the question, is Remington responsible? You may still come to the conclusion, no, they're not. And before you even get to that, I suppose it's a possibility that you may find the United States Supreme Court saying, screw you, Connecticut, you don't understand your own laws. We understand them better than you do, and at least understand the interplay between federal law and yours better than you do, and you can't even proceed to the trial stage. Anything could happen from here. But at least the door is open. An appeal is likely, as the shield for gun makers provided by federal law now has a crack in it that other states could seek to leverage, and that may be why they go to the Supreme Court faster than wait it out. The National Rifle Association fought hard to get the immunity from Congress, saying it was needed to protect U.S. companies from costly and what they see as unfair litigation that blames them for the crimes of others. The organization did not respond to a request for comment. Gun control groups were elated by the court's ruling. The decision is, quote, a victory for the principle that no industry is above the law or above accountability, said a statement from Adam Skaggs, chief counsel of the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. Here, I guess I would add the commentary. This makes a good analog to the stand your ground law phenomenon. It doesn't answer the question of whether the manufacturers are liable. It simply answers the question, for the moment, of whether or not you can ask the question if they're liable. Product liability law has a ready body of jurisprudence to answer the question. It's just that the outcome is uncertain, and you have to ask a jury what they think of it. But the immunity law is all about saying, well, you shouldn't even have to worry about that sort of thing if you're someone as awesome and patriotic as a gun manufacturer. The rest of you manufacturers, if you're a food processor or whatever else, you have to worry about such things. But gun makers shouldn't have to, because America is free and awesome and Second Amendment says blah, blah, blah. And, that's a bit of a stretch, to say the least, that this one certain industry shouldn't have to worry. And it's the same thing like with stand your ground laws. Wouldn't it be great if you didn't actually have to depend on hundreds of years of established self-defense doctrine and sweat while a jury considered whether or not it was applicable? It would be much better for you if you were able, because you used a gun which is awesome and patriotic inherently, to simply skate on it because we just say so in the law, and we can make it through our lobbying arm dangerous for the politicians who make the decision about whether or not the law should say you get to skate, to say, no, that's stupid. It doesn't make any sense why you should single this out for immunity. Well, how about this? Does this make sense? We'll effing destroy you if you don't agree to allow people to skate when they do awesome patriotic murders. Oh, well, that is a complication. I'll have to give that some thought. There's no reason to single this stuff out. It's just, I wish that I didn't even have to justify myself, that I automatically got a pass on it. Because look, isn't it awesome and patriotic to use a gun to murder bad people? Sure it is. You just go ahead and do that. And you just go ahead and march outside of people's homes or outside of their places of worship and threaten them with something they just saw splashed across the headlines a minute ago. It's fair game. You shouldn't even have to go to court to answer for it. All right. Well, anyway, back to our article here. The Connecticut court said the suit, which seeks unspecified damages for each death, could go forward under that state's Unfair Trade Practices Act, a statute aimed at harmful marketing. In this case, marketing not of the weapon, but rather its use as a potential tool for, quote, offensive military-style combat, unquote, by civilians, which is illegal. You know the situation, of course, from Newtown and the December 14th incident, 12/14, as Greg usually refers to it. Our shooter in that case, of course, took his own life. He got the choice to take it. After the assault, and of course he shot and killed his mother in their home before targeting the school. The Bushmaster that he had been sold had been sold to his mother, according to court documents, and shared with him, who was 20 years old at the time of the killings, the number of lives lost in those 264 seconds. And don't forget about the number of lives lost in Las Vegas in the few seconds that it took to perpetrate that. Well, actually, that went on for several minutes. But the point is the damage you can do with these weapons quickly. The number of lives lost in those seconds was made possible by the shooter's weapon of choice, the plaintiff said in their lawsuit. Plaintiffs seek nothing more and nothing less than accountability for Bushmaster's choice to continue profiting from selling and marketing the weapon for civilian use, the suit said. Time for us now to make our exit for our second break. Let's see what else we can fit in before we run out of time here. Among the allegations in the lawsuit was that the gun manufacturers and dealers knowingly marketed the weapons used to carry out deadly missions against, quote, perceived enemies, unquote, as the court said. Such use of the Bushmaster or any weapon would be illegal, it added, and Connecticut law does not permit advertisements that promote or encourage violent criminal behavior. It's a theory, not a bad one either. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We might as well include the concluding paragraph or two of the article because it makes an important distinction for those of you interested in the legal back and forth that will be involved in this case and as it develops in the future. The federal law in question here, called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. And remember, that's where the question hinges here. This is the niche that the Connecticut court found here. Lawful commerce. Is it lawful commerce to market a weapon that says, basically, buy one of these and you'll be able to wipe out all your enemies? I mean, it's a thin reed. It's interesting. And not so much for the Connecticut court to cling to. I don't think that's the thin reed. The thin reed is the disguise. Like, you could switch this up to pretend that the Bushmaster is the weapon of choice for home defense because of how deep in the bushes most people live, or something like that. But instead, I mean, what does Bushmaster mean? You know, it means going out there in the wild to tromp through the jungles and gun down your enemies. And what they're saying is this particular marketing plan and others that they've engaged in that are equally stupid, but I don't know that are necessarily covered by this one, like the get your man card back thing, right? All right, well, let's talk about lawful commerce. And is it lawful to say that, yeah, you can tromp through the woods and gun lots of people down with this? Well, that's not really a lawful use of the weapon. And it might be that they can just disguise it by saying, well, my enemies are deer. They eat my tulip bulbs. Maybe. We'll see whether you're able to make that work. Okay. Anyway, the federal law called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act does immunize firearms makers from liability for crimes committed by people using their weapons, the court agreed. This is an interesting distinction here. The Connecticut court says, yeah, you're immunized against people using your weapons to commit crime. But, it said, we also conclude that Congress has not clearly manifested an intent to extinguish the traditional authority of our legislature and our courts to protect the people of Connecticut from the pernicious practices alleged in the present case, i.e. the advertising of using the thing for big-time murder. It's true, we're not holding you accountable for the murders committed by the shooter in Sandy Hook. We are holding you accountable for putting it in his head that this would be a good weapon for big-time murders. That's slightly different, isn't it? The dissenting justices, it's close enough that, of course, there will be dissenting justices. What was the numbers involved? We read it at the top of the piece. I got to scroll all the way back here. 4-3. There you go. So pretty close. The dissent said that the majority in this national question of first impression was misreading the federal shield law. It doesn't exactly spend, well, it spends zero time exploring in the article how or what they mean by misreading the federal shield law. And that will be of some interest. If you're trying to predict what comes next in Connecticut or perhaps in the United States Supreme Court, that would be important. But look, this is a report of, hey, news has been made, a decision in which the majority says this is the way it's going to be in Connecticut is out. I don't necessarily blame them. I think in the legal journals you'll find more coverage of what the dissent said. And depending on how things go for the foreseeable future, that dissent may or may not be important to study up on after that. Why is this back in my feed here? Did I? Yeah, no, I don't know. Gmail has some weird new practices of bringing up email threads that don't have new responses, but instead they say, well, it's been a couple of days since you had this discussion. Do you want to discuss it some more with this person? What? No. Is that money in Google's pocket? It's like engagement with a website. Does it really count? Is it really worth money to you whether I engage with my own email? Let's see. Yes, here's a reminder from am I supposed to attribute it to you personally? I don't know. When it comes through email, I'm not really sure whether people want their names read or not, but a listener who notes, just had to note that the Las Vegas shooting victims are not just the dead, but the injured whose injuries, physical and otherwise, have changed their lives forever. The survivors are victims too. Absolutely true. And I don't think anybody's really saying that I mean to exclude them, but that's not the point of the comment. The point is to remind everybody that that's true, and we do talk about that from time to time, not just necessarily in the context of mass shootings, but just the individual shootings, and how many times we've brought up gun failed discussions where we've said, the local reporting about this particular gun fail says that the victim is expected to recover, which I always found to be a weird construction because of the many different ways in which it could be interpreted. Expected to recover, like we, the gun-owning Americans in this country who refuse to accept responsibility for this, expect you to recover. Damn it, it's your responsibility to recover. Everything's gonna be fine, and it's all on you. And very often it is not. Like the victim is expected to make a full recovery, by which we mean they'll be alive tomorrow and the next day and paying taxes and probably going to work for several years in the future, but with a limp or with one leg, but they're expected to make a full recovery. I don't know I'm not sure whether the reporters ever, whether they would say something different if they knew with certainty, well, that leg is going to be amputated. Are they going to make a full recovery now? No, the victim is expected to make a partial recovery, or they're paralyzed. It's weird, and you're never really sure. And sometimes it's just wishful thinking, and sometimes they think, a full recovery with a limp, that's still a full recovery. And sometimes I guess it's, you know what, you'll be fine. You actually won't even walk with a limp. You got lucky in the way you were hit. But yeah, it's a weird gray area about that. And I guess it says something about the business model of journalism too. How many victims were there of the Las Vegas shootings? Well, there were 60 or whatever the number is. No, there were 600. And there were hundreds more who are injured, who are have psychological injuries, and people who weren't there who have psychological injuries, because now my job is taking care of my fully recovered son or daughter who used to be an independent earner and lived with a significant other independently elsewhere, but now has a colostomy, and their relationship fell apart as well, and they've moved back home. There are a lot of victims. So it's a good point. And thank you for making it. And again, I'm not certain sometimes whether people want their names read out. Sometimes it would be very nice to have your name read out, and other times you say, well, I ordinarily would have contacted you via Twitter, where I could be named by my anonymous handle, but I have chosen, because of their laptop situation, to contact you by email, and I didn't mean for you to read my name out loud. So you never know. And you don't have to follow up unless you really would like your name read, in which case I'd be happy to do it. Okay. Phew. There's a lot of meta today. It's one of those sorts of days. All right, let's go back into Pocket. And now I think we might be able to back away from the theme that's running through all of this, but I don't know. I'm not certain. Should we spend the time on the Adam Serwer article? Would that just keep us mired in this? Should we escape from this and take a look at some other topics? There's also, we could go much farther afield. I do have some listener contributions. I have no way of segueing to these things. These are very different, and I feel like I've been sitting on these, or at least one of them, for a long time, that I have to apologize to our listener who submitted it, because it was lost in my inbox basically since forever. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like maybe today's not the day to segue to that stuff. But then what day is? And it's usually, if Friday isn't it, then I don't know what was. But at any rate, apologies to our Twitter friend Peace Arena, who we have had submissions from before, Serena Blaze, who had sent us some time ago in late February a great local story, as she often does, from Oklahoma. But I don't know. I think I could be forgiven for saying today may not end up being the day for that. But what else to go to? Let me see. Adam Serwer's pieces usually are rather long and involved, and maybe it's best that we all just sort of absorb this thing slowly, and either with an entire show dedicated to it or over the weekend. But it takes on new relevance. Again, the piece I'm talking about here from yesterday, I think, White Nationalism's Deep American Roots. There's a lot to it, and the main thrust of the article is, and maybe it takes on a certain, little bit different connotation today, but the original intent of the piece was to point out, one, that white nationalism can by no means be considered a new thing in this country. And I guess today we would remind ourselves that white, quote, nationalism, which I guess is internationalism in a way, or it's franchised around the world. There's lots of nations where white nationalists think exactly the same thing and would permit free movement of white people and their products and goods and etc. Free trade in whiteness around the world, while blocking the freedom of anybody else to engage in the same thing. So it's international in scope. but also that I guess the most famous incarnation of white nationalism with international aspects would have been the World War II era German Nazi movement, and what came as a surprise revelation to many people that there's historical proof in documentary proof of Adolf Hitler's claiming to have taken inspiration for his insane ideology American writers who preceded him in the same work. And that's an important part, and it's expressed here in the subheader. Again, the title, White Nationalism's Deep American Roots. Subhead, a long overdue excavation of the book that Hitler called his Bible and the man who wrote it. Now, subsequently, there are plenty of people running around, idiots, saying that their Bible is Hitler's book. So where does Hitler's book come from? Well, allegedly from an American book. And obviously, Adam has done a great job. It is said, because I have not read the thing, in making that connection and in reminding people that the original Hitler may have been American, I suppose, is the way you would have to put it. Hitler in the sense of the book writing, anti-social philosophy Hitler versus the actualization Hitler, I guess. But I don't know. Sometimes it makes no sense to draw those lines anymore, and maybe today is a good day to think about that. All right, let's see. Again, not much in the way of normal segues here. What to go to next? I'm going to have to scan through Twitter. I know there are other stories that make some sense, and I don't know. I've got to wade through a lot of other things that are interesting and would otherwise have made great Friday material, but that I guess maybe aren't necessarily the place you want to go here to. What should we do with this? Maybe I can include this. Is this gonna fit here? I know I hate to do the housekeeping here, but this is one of those days where you gotta do the thinking out loud. Let me take a look at this here. I took a piece the other day and last week from Slate. I had a Slate pitch. And I guess because we opened with discussion of Ilhan Omar, it might fit here. This Sophie Worthen's piece in Slate, the Ilhan Omar controversy is a turning point for the Jewish left. I wonder if this will make sense today. The tide seems to be turning for Representative Ilhan Omar. Last week she made, this is a week old again, she made critical comments about American supporters of Israel that were interpreted by some as a reference to the anti-Semitic trope of dual loyalty. This sparked swift and widespread condemnation, including from the leaders of the Democratic Party, who put forward a planned resolution condemning anti-Semitism as a rebuke of the Congresswoman. You know how that developed. And let me use this also, as foreshadowing for next week. Next Tuesday, the 19th, if I have my dates correct, we'll be welcoming back to the show Ian Reifowitz, who has got a number of things to catch us up on, including yet another book is the hook we use for this, but who wrote a piece I noticed the other day that will take exception with some of this. So it'll maybe, I don't know if that's going to be the focus of our discussion. Perhaps not, although perhaps we want to address it. But he had an essay at Daily Kos recently which takes some exception with the idea that, or with the defense that Ilhan Omar's comments weren't necessarily trading in precisely that dual loyalty anti-Semitism trope, anti-Semitic trope. And still lots of room for interpretation on that. And I acknowledge it. I do come to a different conclusion in him, but I cannot totally exclude the possibility that that was in mind for her. I don't know that she meant to invoke it. I don't know if she was being coy about invoking it, but I do know that I would like to entertain the possibility that that wasn't foremost in mind, but it was absolutely necessary for someone to have some kind of conversation with her and say, and Armando made this point too, and say to her, this is the sort of thing that comes to mind for people when this comes up. Not all people think the same, but a lot of people who aren't crazy for thinking so do think this when these kinds of words come up. And are you aware of this, and shouldn't you be being careful about it? And Armando's point was, yeah, but we did do that the last time she found herself in trouble, the week before. When, again, I have this difficulty. Well, last time it was the all about the Benjamins thing. Well, money and anti-Semitic tropes there. Yeah, but on the other hand, it's also the quote of a popular song lyric, and it's sort of a almost age-appropriate reference, especially if you're not necessarily brought up in this country. There's a segment of the population which is sensitive about that. And, while you may not have realized all of that because of your having been raised in another country, which makes you a valuable voice. On the other hand, it should be pointed out that, the country you were raised in doesn't have a lot of, public discussion about being sensitive to worries about anti-Semitic tropes either. So it's a discussion that needs to be had. My preference is that it not be had in form of a resolution and a floor vote, but that's how these folks who are delivering the admonition work. That's their job. So it's, understandable that it manifests itself in that way. And like I acknowledge, Armando's not wrong in saying, but we've had this discussion, and why do we keep ending up here? And I guess ultimately all I can say is, 2 strikes is not an out. So, okay. But she's not out either. She's still sitting there. But, we're still reading stories about how people are contemplating getting rid of her, even if they're not the people that we would necessarily think are capable of pulling it off. Although I don't know who you think is capable of doing it, if not Democratic leaders in that district. But maybe the ones that are quoted aren't really leaders there. They just are people who are mouthing off. That's possible too. There's a lot of nuance in the world. All right. So, it notes here in the Slate piece we're reading from Sophie Worthen, but an increasing number of progressives, including Representative Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders as well, have come to Omar's defense in recent days, plus a lot of other people. Many see a double standard at play. They argue that Omar, a black Muslim woman, is being unfairly singled out for a misstatement while the party's leaders stay silent on offensive remarks by other politicians. Parenthetically, it adds, after dissent from the progressive wing of the party, the Democratic resolution was amended to denounce all forms of hate. It passed the House, was it last Thursday? 2 Thursdays ago? 407 to 23, with all Democrats ultimately voting for it, which at least speaks to the ability of people to work it out and come to something that they can all support and be on the same team. That, I think, helped mitigate. I mean, I still think the resolution path was kind of a dumb one, but if you're going to have one, and you have to, you can't just drop it after you blurt out that you're going to have a resolution. That's one of the problems that I have with how it was handled. Was it was initially like, hey, everybody, we're going to have a resolution on this. Well, now we're stuck with the resolution, and we're going to have to end up doing kind of a dumb one in order to get the party unified behind it, which is, after all, Nancy Pelosi's job. You want to hold everybody together. But if you had instead said to people, look, until we think we have something that gets all people together on this side about this thing, keep your mouth shut and don't introduce this thing. That's the mistake I think was made there. Alongside the intra-party squabble, Jewish American leftists, yikes, that's an anti-Semitic trope, have emerged as a key source of support for Omar, writing a flurry of op-eds, petitions, and social media posts with the hashtag #IStandWithIlhan. I took the same position, but never really could convince myself to use the hashtag #IStandWithIlhan. I hate the I stand with formulation usually, but there's a nuanced position for you. Yeah, I agree, but I don't stand with here. I'm just saying I stand with myself. I don't stand with too many other people, quite honestly. For somebody who encourages team play, it's very difficult to make me stand with the team. It's another aspect of organizing and the difficulty of holding a caucus together. Progressive Jewish organizations like Jewish Voices, I assume, it says Jewish Voice for Peace, but I would bet there's more than one. Jewish Voice for Peace, and another organization, If Not Now, and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, are responding to the Omar flap by emphasizing the difference between anti-Semitism and legitimate critiques of Israel. We already know about that division. And pivoting to discuss the threat of white supremacy to all minority groups. Parenthetically, a disclosure from the writer. She was a summer intern at Jewish Voice for Peace, I guess it is singular, in college, and I'm still a member. This source of full-throated support of the Congresswoman has the potential to shift the national conversation over anti-Semitism and how it operates. It's also a sign of the growing rift within the American Jewish community over Israel-Palestine as leftist Jewish movements gain momentum. Leo Ferguson, the movement-building organizer at Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, expressed hope that this controversy could serve as a valuable learning experience for the Jewish community and the American public more broadly. The opportunity here, if we take it, is for all of us to become much sharper in our understanding of anti-Semitism, Ferguson told me. There is an incredibly powerful opening for white Jews to understand their deep mutual interest and potential solidarity with black people because white supremacy is coming for all of us. Rebecca Pierce, a member of the Jews of Color and Sephardi Mizrahi Caucus. Good, there's a little bit of an explainer coming up. Just in some of you, if that doesn't ring a bell for you, Sephardi Mizrahi Caucus, which organizes in partnership with Jewish Voice for Peace, agrees. Now, parenthetically, the explainer, Sephardi, S-E-P-H-A-R-D-I, if it doesn't ring a bell and you want to do some Googling, refers to Jewish communities whose ancestors were expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492. Fascinating history to be discovered there. And look up also, if it doesn't link you to it, probably Wikipedia will take you there. Crypto Jews, essentially, and other Spanish words for the same. It'll likely all be linked, but you'll find fascinating articles about Hispanic families settled in Mexico, New Mexico, California, the American South, that still hold over practices that sometimes people don't even understand how they got to these practices. Why has our family done this all the time? And it turns out, if you do the genealogy, we are members of the Jewish communities expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492. And at a certain point, even here in overseas in Mexico, we're forced to deny that we were. Anyway, moving on from there, Mizrahi, M-I-Z-R-A-H-I, refers to Jewish communities from the Middle East, West Asia, and North Africa. Pierce said the most important way to respond to this controversy is to develop a robust definition of anti-Semitism that goes beyond the context of Israel. Probably wise. Anti-Semitism is hatred, animus, bias toward Jewish people as a whole, and this is a historical thing that predates the existence of the State of Israel, Pierce explained. Therefore, to have a definition of anti-Semitism that is totally wrapped up in how we're allowed to talk about this modern ethno-state is really a disservice. Let's not forget our music here, but now we're going to be late because my click didn't take. Come on, you. All right. Where do we leave off here? I'll jump to the next paragraph, basically. If our definition of anti-Semitism is reduced to, are you criticizing Israel? You have no ability to grapple with someone like Richard Spencer, for instance. The prominent American white supremacist activist is also an avowed supporter of Israel. That is difficult to sort out. My mind, nuance everywhere. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on it. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And we'll have a little extra music to get through today. But let's pick up again with the Slate piece here. And I guess I cut off in one of the earlier paragraphs, but I think you all get the point of this. And an interesting point here made, if our definition of anti-Semitism is reduced to, are you criticizing Israel? And I don't think anybody really believes that here, but lots of people do. You have no ability to grapple with someone like Richard Spencer, who counts himself or claims to be a supporter of Israel. Now, you probably could and should spend a lot of time, and we have on the show, rejecting the idea that he's a supporter of Israel. No, you're not. You say you are so that you won't get in trouble, but you are not. It's completely understandable that Jews are on edge, though, and are concerned and are looking around, trying to figure out who their allies are and who they can trust, Ferguson said. I've lost track of everybody here. Ferguson, because we were just talking about Rebecca Pierce. Leo Ferguson, organizer of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. Okay. But yeah, good question. Looking around, who can you actually trust in all this? At the same time, he cautioned that Jewish Americans' legitimate fears have at times been exploited by figures on the right as a way to pit Jews against other marginalized communities. There's definitely a pattern of hyper-policing the language of black activists and leaders when it comes to showing solidarity with Palestine, Pierce said. The pattern that I've noticed is that someone will say something and then critics will twist their words in such a way that they're really changing the fundamental point that was being made and trying to make it a generalization about Jews when someone is talking about Israel. And we've seen this over and over again. This scenario has played out numerous times over the past few months. Since December, black activists including Mark Lamont Hill, Angela Davis, Michelle Alexander, and Ilhan Omar have all faced substantial blowback for their support of Palestinian rights. A lot of this is backlash to progress that's happening, and we need to refuse to cede that ground, Pierce said. Our struggles are connected, and we're going to continue to acknowledge that our common enemy is white supremacy, so we need to be working together to fight it. Imogen Page, an If Not Now member who is active in the Twin Cities branch, explained why she felt it was significant for Jewish activists to express support for Omar. What we're doing right now is standing up and saying, no, You cannot use our history and our pain and our trauma to drive a wedge between Jews and the other people you are marginalizing and putting in danger. Activists like Ferguson, Pierce, and Page acknowledge that their strategy is more challenging than condemnation and rejection and requires far more patience and soul-searching, but they also hope that it will strengthen their movement. The campaigns to defend Omar could be seen as a detour from these organizations' primary advocacy work around Israel-Palestine, but some activists see defending Omar as part of a broader push to shift conversations within the Jewish community. There's really an attempt to paint the people supporting Ilhan Omar as totally outside the norm, totally outside the Jewish community. We're actually all very involved in the Jewish community, Pierce said, and Pierce explained that advocating for Omar is inherently connected to the issue of more recognition for diverse voices in the Jewish community and not letting the same several organizations that are incredibly out of touch a lot of the time with what our needs and experiences are speak for us. Progressive Jewish activists have secured numerous victories in recent years. Public opinion on Israel-Palestine is moving to the left, especially among young people, and Jewish Americans are increasingly critical of Israeli government policies and the occupation. Local politicians like Omar are bringing these once fringe positions further into the mainstream, and American Jewish leftists see this as a moment to amplify their message and pitch their position to a national audience. I've been in Palestine solidarity for a long time, since I was in college, and I've seen huge changes, leaps and bounds, Pierce said. On Palestine, so many things that were taboo are now mainstream, and I don't think there's a way to shut it down. Now, there's plenty to be said on that front, including plenty to be said that's critical. Ordinarily, I would at this point say, you know what, I'm going to read Ian's latest from Daily Kos, but I don't know whether that's, on the one hand, that's like, no, we absolutely would have to give equal time and consideration to a contrasting viewpoint. On the other hand, Ian will be here on Tuesday, so is it foolish to spend time now stating his position when he could come on and state it much more clearly himself on Tuesday? And on the other hand, that might not be one he wants to spend his time with on Tuesday. So, I don't know. It's difficult to decide what to do. Did I noted his piece, and I'm wondering, did I put it aside? Because, I'm leaning actually towards, at the very least, letting you know, as an interested listener and reader, where you could find that, even if our time is limited here today. Yeah, I'm going to do that. Let me find Ian's piece, because, like I said, I found it very interesting, and though I had points of disagreement with it, like with anything, when people come on here, I find, oh, I agree with that. Oh, I disagree with that. Oh, I agree with this. Bits and pieces, and I can't, what do you do? Blanket reject something? Sometimes when it's horrible. Not this. Not likely to happen with our folks here. I like you guys, you see. Here's the piece I'm thinking of from last Sunday. Progressive leaders, and this is true also, progressive leaders can't use anti-Semitic rhetoric, period. That's what the result of this must be. And, okay, yes, point taken. And I guess the point I take away from it is, all right, it is absolutely true that there needs to be some reckoning for Ilhan Omar, a conversation to be had. Is it had on the floor in the form of a resolution? Some say yes. Others differ. And we'll have to leave it there. I don't know. Is it a disservice not to read the piece? I've made my case, is the best I can say. You should read it. And, there's points to be gleaned from it, certainly. And like I said, I don't know if that's how Ian wants to spend his time on Tuesday. But if not, you should read this. And in fact, we'll probably instead be discussing his forthcoming book, The tribalization of politics. Maybe we'll discuss it because it'll be part of the discussion. Or very often when he's writing an essay, he's developing themes that either will become books or have just become books or are relevant to something he's been speaking about in book form. So it should surprise no one that there's this opening. Maybe it is what we'll discuss on Tuesday. The tribalization of politics. How Rush Limbaugh's race-baiting rhetoric on the Obama presidency paved the way for Trump. I'm sure there's room for the essay in that discussion. But at a minimum, you should look for and read Ian Reifowitz's Reifowitz. Progressive leaders can't use anti-Semitic rhetoric, period. That's what the result of this must be. It couldn't go without remarking on, yes. And the pain that the anti-Semitic trope can evoke, whether you meant to evoke the trope, maybe that's the new word for it, the trope or not, whether you meant to invoke the pain or not, people are going to need to know and have a right to know that Ilhan Omar understands what people think when she says the things she says. How the conversation is had, well, there's room for differences of opinion, I think, on that. And I think it's also a valid point of view, though I have to make a decision for myself. Where do I prefer to be? I prefer to be in private conversation. Others will say, this has progressed beyond what private conversation is capable of solving, and the pain is widespread, is widely enough felt that a public conversation needs to be had. I think that's a legitimate viewpoint. It wouldn't be the one I adopt, but it's legitimate nonetheless. That's what I'm saying here in invoking Ian's piece. And we'll leave the rest of that for Tuesday because I have a feeling that he'll be more more effective in advocating that viewpoint on his own than I will be now. Let's see. All right, let's see. Mighty OCD says, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for an IP opinion piece today. I don't know. It's funny. I don't know whether that means I should read it or not. If I'm trying to glean an actual ruling out of this. All right. I think we'll use the time that we have left differently, although, that would close it out on point, at least for the day. But let's see. I want to scroll through a few more stories and things stored in Pocket and see if maybe I can use something else to make you annoyed or inform you for the weekend. What's this one here? I have to open some of these. Not always obvious what I... Oh, you know what? This is sort of interesting. Where did this one come from? Not always obvious in the Pocket view what I'm looking at. I've put something aside, but the particulars of it aren't always visible. I have in Pocket the tweet for a different reason of Shireen Al-Ademi, assistant professor of education at Michigan State University, and obviously visibly Muslim in name and photograph, wearing her hijab. But this is I guess this is arguably on topic. Yesterday's Senate vote on the I guess this was tweeted yesterday, so it would have been Wednesday's Senate vote on Yemen, the Yemen resolution, mentioned on Wednesday and Thursday on the show as part of a double-fisted, which it wouldn't be fisted if it's a slap, right? A double-fisted slap in the face, a two-handed slap in the face, or two slaps delivered to the face anyway, of Trump, or two rifts between Trump and his Republican conference in the Senate, where Republicans bucked him on both the Yemen resolution, on the state of emergency resolution. An interesting point. Good, interesting mention yesterday by Greg of how the narrow wording and sparse wording of the resolution of disapproval of the state of emergency created a difficult parliamentary situation for Republicans who wanted to amend the resolution of disapproval to say that they really approved of it, essentially. I disagree with this exercise of executive authority, but agree with the sentiment that motivated it, that there is an emergency. That was prevented by the narrow language and sparse language of the resolution. There was no way to add that as a germane amendment, except by, voting to break the rules momentarily. To add that as a germane amendment to something that was so narrow and so targeted. We read the 70 to 80 words of the resolution in a tweet on the air. It's as simple as could possibly be. And by the way, Ben Sass, who chickened out of voting in favor of the resolution yesterday, and who's as empty a suit as there could possibly be at this point, crying and moping. Oh, Tom Tillis, too, crying and moping, even in an op-ed published about how he had a duty to constrain the executive in this situation, but decided not to. Basically saying, oh no, how terrible this whole thing is. I can't support the resolution though because something. I don't even remember what he said. But saying that it was a political stunt by Pelosi and it was an overbroad thing, and it was literally as narrow a piece of legislation as was possible on point. It's the ultimate in small government reigning in the executive power in addition, but the ultimate in small government legislation. It was as narrow as it could possibly be and as pointed and targeted as it could possibly be. One purpose and one purpose only to this resolution. And you couldn't amend it because it was so tight. Now suddenly he's for expansive power of the federal government. Okay, but anyway, this just part one in how the language of the resolution created parliamentary difficulties. On the Yemen bill, parliamentary difficulties created as well, but in a different way. Shireen Al-Ademi noting yesterday's Senate vote should have sent the Yemen bill to Trump. Instead, it has to go back to the House again. Why? Because House Republicans amended Ro Khanna's Yemen bill with additional language that isn't germane to Yemen. And so the Senate wasn't able to pass the version of the original Yemen bill as it arrived in the Senate. It had to expunge the language added by a Republican amendment in order to be able to pass the thing. That's interesting, although now I don't really understand why do you expunge non-germane additions that you didn't add? I don't know that it's necessarily against Senate rules to do that, but I guess this is the way it turned out, or they convinced themselves, or they played an interesting parliamentary game. Now, I left out part of her tweet. What was the language? The House GOP, because I wanted to actually first get to how the House Republicans amended this bill. I am not positive that this is the case, but I think that I remember that, one, the language they were adding was language about anti-Semitism. In other words, I don't know whether they were reacting directly to, I guess I have to look at the timing, to Ilhan Omar, but it may be the case. They may have been talking about the earlier incident with the all about the Benjamins stuff instead of the AIPAC aimed comments. But this the mechanism that I think that they used to add this, in other words, one, the House has already acted and gone on record speaking about anti-Semitism, but I prefer, for procedural reasons, that they not have done it. Plus, I also think that legislating about it at the moment was unwise, but it was added, I believe, by a motion to recommit, which, interestingly, the Democratic caucus is trying to come around to a universal position on opposing, which they ought to be doing. But I think a motion to recommit was offered to the Yemen bill in the House, saying, well, that's all well and good, but how about this? Our last minute amendment to the Yemen bill is, shouldn't we all be condemning anti-Semitism in the form specifically invoked, we say, by a Democratic member who is a Muslim woman in this body? And Democrats were convinced to jump ship and join in passing this thing, which adds non-germane garbage about, really, honestly, coming from Republicans, disingenuous garbage about anti-Semitism. I don't take my instructions from them on anti-Semitism, not when they're doing the things that cause people to shoot up synagogues here in the United States, much as they are shooting up mosques, both here and elsewhere. But anyway, they added that to the Yemen bill, and that ends up in the Senate, and the Senate agrees on Yemen, but has to agree in a revised version, apparently, of the story, of the resolution, because it has this non-germane garbage added by Republicans to it. And now it has to go back to the House and get voted on again. Let me look at the story she linked to from Politico. House GOP taunts Dems with surprise vote to condemn anti-Semitism. And I think this will confirm the question of the use of the motion to recommit here. House Democrats were forced to vote Wednesday on a measure condemning anti-Semitism. This is a piece, by the way, from mid-February. It's February 13th is the date of this piece. They were forced to vote that particular Wednesday on a measure condemning anti-Semitism, which they were going to apparently get around to anyway, a gambit by House Republicans to embarrass the majority party in the wake of controversial comments by Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota. So, by the way, in this context, right, getting the House to vote on controversial comments and to condemn controversial comments by Ilhan Omar is a gambit by House Republicans to embarrass the majority party. Well, don't worry about it, whether this thing passes or not, and it did, and it caused additional troubles later on down the road, unrelated to Ilhan Omar and our own divisions. But, hello, it was designed to embarrass the majority party. Don't worry about that, whether it passes or not. We'll embarrass ourselves later. That's essentially what bothered me about this whole thing. GOP leaders used the procedural tactic known as a motion to recommit, as a messaging tool to put Democrats on the spot after Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her deputies publicly denounced Omar's comments this week. Thanks for opening the door. The surprise maneuver came when GOP leaders offered language condemning anti-Semitism to a high-profile foreign policy measure, causing a 30-minute holdup on the floor as top Democratic leaders huddled to discuss the next steps. You know how long the holdup on the floor is? If the next step on every single motion to recommit ever offered is vote no, the end, 0 seconds. But instead we had a 30-minute holdup as they huddle to discuss what to do. Should we allow our members to, because we're going to offer an amendment. Well, if you're going to offer a resolution saying much the same thing, or it's even been considered, then do it. And you say, you know who doesn't get to offer this resolution? Them. We won. We control this floor. If we want to embarrass ourselves, goddamn it, we're going to do it ourselves. I mean, really, That's the actual answer. Then, in a highly unusual move, all Democrats voted in favor of the GOP amendment, which is also incredible and incredibly stupid because we just had the big fight over, shouldn't we all be voting no? Well, if we're going to offer one, then we should just take theirs. No, let's all vote yes. No, let's all vote no and offer our own freestanding resolution. Let's do both. Oh my God, you shot yourself in both feet. Why? Democrats dismissed the partisan move and noted that most Republicans voted against the underlying Yemen resolution that contains the language condemning anti-Semitism. And that's another important point in all this. That's what's wrong with this place, about this place. They pushed for a motion to try to make us look bad, and then they're forced to vote against their own motion after the bill passes, said Representative Max Rose, Democrat of New York, who is Jewish and who later was saying we got to condemn Ilhan Omar in our own freestanding resolution. You see what happened here? He's got a point too. I mean, it's negated in the end by the fact that he's the one helping load the gun to shoot us in both feet, but he's right in the underlying fact here. Republicans are going to insist that we amend this thing so that it contains the anti-Semitism warnings. And then it will be added to the Yemen bill. And then we'll say, okay, now that it's been amended, what do we all say? Let's all vote on the newly amended Yemen bill. And all the Republicans will vote no on it. Well, isn't that hypocrisy? Well, yes, it is. Why did you decide to unanimously aid them in committing this hypocrisy? Because then we would be able to point to their hypocrisy. You would have been able to point to their hypocrisy anyway. You knew they were going to vote no on the underlying bill. I don't understand. They were trying to embarrass us. They played a game, added House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer of Maryland, who said it didn't work because all Democrats voted in favor. Guess what? It did work because all Democrats voted in favor. And you came back with your own resolution later. It confirms the gotcha nature. They were for it before they were against it. Well, guess what? So were you. That's it. You convinced everybody to be for it and then against it and angry about it, but then for it again by coming up with another resolution later. Democrats can no longer claim that these types of votes are merely procedural and not substantive, the National Republican Congressional Committee wrote in its email blast afterwards. I skipped a little paragraph here, which is just a sentence. Within minutes of the vote, the House GOP's campaign arm released a statement calling out Democrats. In other words, they then took that vote where all the Democrats switched and said, you know what? You won't catch us in a gotcha. We'll vote for it. So, ha! To which the Republicans said, fine, it's an easy play. This trap was written in 2006, and we've used it again. Now, if you vote against it, we'll say, you're for anti-Semitism. You're the party that hates Jews, just as the president just did. Or if you vote for it because, you can't get us, we'll get ourselves, then you say, good. Next time you guys encourage everybody to vote no on any and all motions to recommit and say, well, if it's a tough one, because of the so-called substance, you can go back and tell your constituents, it's just a procedural vote. And now they say, well, if it was just a procedural vote, why did you convince all the Democrats to vote yes on it? You can no longer say that. Well, you can say whatever you want, and they can say whatever they want about it in response. But the fact is, now we're stuck in that infinite loop as well. Because most Democrats are not informed about the GOP's plans ahead of time on such procedural tactics, the vote caused a brief scramble on the House floor. After it was announced, Eliot Engel, Democrat of New York, one of the House's highest-ranking Jewish members, said on the floor, I rise in support of this resolution. Multiple GOP lawmakers stood up and cheered, and so did some moderate Democrats like Representatives Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, Joe Cunningham of South Carolina, Kendra Horn of Oklahoma, and Anthony Brindisi of New York. It's the first time since May 2010 that a motion to recommit has succeeded, as Republicans were quick to gloat. Do you know why it's been since 2010 that a motion to proceed has succeeded? And that is because that was the last time a motion to proceed was offered by minority Republicans in a majority Democratic House. That was the last time it worked because Republicans don't brook this kind of crap. The motion was approved 424-0, with libertarian-leaning Republicans Justin Amash of Michigan and Thomas Massey of Kentucky voting present. The amendment will be added to the House resolution to cut off the U.S. aid to Saudi Arabia in Yemen's civil war. The measure has strong odds of passing the Senate, though it would almost certainly be vetoed by President Donald Trump, so maybe it's all not worth it. But what ended up happening, as we now find out, yes, the Senate passed it. Yes, the Senate even passed it, I think, perhaps overwhelmingly. I mean, at least relatively speaking. I don't know if it was veto-proof or not, but it doesn't matter because it ends up back in the House instead of on the president's desk, because Democrats who wanted this thing passed as a messaging effort, if nothing else, if they were anticipating the veto, have screwed it up. And it isn't on the president's desk now in a 1-2 punch. It's back in the House where they'll face yet another, perhaps, motion to recommit the thing over the same issue. And how will they even instruct their members to vote then? I don't know. Well, this hasn't made anybody feel any better, I'm sure. It was a tough show. But we brought it back to domestic politics. We at least have that going for us. Stay tuned next for West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy when Justice Putnam takes his best stab at dealing with the day.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
He's got an interesting show lined up, and a lot of it will depend on fantastic performances once again by both Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other newer members in committee hearings roasting Republicans. He's got lots of great stuff to discuss, and that and much more. Keeping it domestic, I guess. Justice, on to you.